Then Monsanto had bought up a patent from a company called Delta and Pineland, with the United States Agriculture Department had worked on what is called the Terminator Seed. How many of you have heard of it? Well, basically the Terminator Seed was genetically engineering a seed and releasing a lethal toxin at the time when the embryo was forming in the seed. So in effect, you would have sterile seed. So when I was listening to the announcements on the wheatgrass, I said, no, wheatgrass from Terminator Seed or wheat, you're not going to have germination. And this was a way to counter the deficiency that only certain crops have been hybridized. Soybean, for example, is not. So for the two ways in which there's control over the future generation of seed. One is law, which is the patent issue, but to implement it, you need to have an entire structure of policing. And I want to give you some examples of what this policing has meant. Hybridization means you create seed that doesn't breed true, so farmers are forced to buy seed every year. But by putting Terminator technology, you can ensure that no seed can be saved, because now it's in the biology of the seed to terminate itself. But can you imagine a world where Bija, the very source of life, is robbed of its life? And because it was so outrageous, we mobilized the Convention on Biological Diversity to put a ban on it. I've talked often of how, whether it is the first generation of breeding, which is crossbreeding, for chemicals, we've done crossbreeding forever. But for chemicals, it's a very recent phenomenon. It's only in the last 50, 60 years. And this is what was given the name the Green Revolution. I have watched what it did to the seed in Punjab. Because normally, when we grow food, when seed gives food, it gives food for the pollinator, it gives food for the animals, the straw, it gives food for the soil organisms, which is the straw that gets recycled. That's why Matsunobu Fukuoka, a brilliant farmer from Japan, wrote a book called The One Straw Revolution. And then it gives grain, part of which we eat, and part of which we save as seed for the next season. So seed gives rise to seed, gives rise to seed, gives rise to seed, forever. And the desperate attempt of industry has been to prevent seed from being seed, which basically means preventing creation from being creation. And that's why I often also say, for Monsanto, GMO is nothing less than God move over. Out of the way. Now we'll parade as being the creators of the universe. Technologies are extremely crude, so they couldn't manage to pump chemicals into the old varieties. So they had to make them dwarf varieties. That's all that Norman Borlaug, who got the Nobel Peace Prize for the Green Revolution in Punjab, did. He made the wheat dwarf. Now you can pump a lot of chemicals and it doesn't lodge. But that means you've got rid of a very important part of the plant, the straw. And this is the reason you're feeding so many animals and a concentrated animal feed, which is the reason for the methane emissions from factory farms, which is the reason for the mad cow epidemic. I don't know how many of you remember that basically sheep had got scrapie and they were dying, so they ground them up and made them sheep feed and cow feed. Then the cows started to die, so they ground them up, and the word used for this is called rendering. It's a very dangerous word because it doesn't tell you where it started and where it ends. And that's why all these rendering places that America set up after 9/11, they just said, rendering, we are rendering so-and-so, you know. You pick up anyone and say, so-and-so is being rendered. Well, they rendered dead, infected cows and fed them to cows. And then they made beef patties out of it. And when people ate that, 12 people died in England of the CJD. The very, very important point that was realized then, there was no straw to feed animals. There was no grass for grazing. Animals were in factories now. How many of you remember an old film called Soylent Green? Well, it tells you the future we'll have if we don't create another future. Because if it can be done to cows, it can be done to us. And already, I think large numbers of people are being denied their right to real food and therefore to real health. But the GMOs also contaminate. So in Canada, a farmer called Percy Smizer, his field was contaminated with GMO canola, Roundup Ready canola. And Monsanto started a case against him. He said, but I never took your canola. But the problem is, if you allow a patent on a gene, in the case of Canada, they don't allow a patent on a plant, but they allow a patent on a gene. And the fact that it's in a plant means, in effect, that plant is also theirs. So, if you have a patent on a gene, then its occurrence anywhere without the permission of the patent holder is an intellectual property theft. And having contaminated Percy's field, Monsanto sued him, $200,000. We intervened with many other organizations, and the case went all the way to Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, they struck down the fine, and there was a minority decision which said, but we should knock down the patents on genes, because if you accept patents on genes, this kind of thing will happen. And the others said, well, if that's the law, then that's the law. And in the corridors of that case, I remember a statement was made by the Monsanto lawyer which said, if it's through contamination, we are going to control the crops of the world. That's what we're going to do. 1,500 cases were put against American farmer after contamination. Farmers' fields were contaminated, but farmers were sued. There's a very good report by the Center for Food Safety. I know Andrew Kimbrell hasn't come this year, but he's been here in the past. Monsanto versus US farmers. The report, the book I was reading out from is my 30 years of work on biodiversity and intellectual property. It's called Origin, the Corporate War on Nature and Culture. So far published in India. I don't know if ever in the US you're going to have a debate on patents on seed. It's been a very big missing part of both the environmental movement as well as the health movement. It's like, it's a central piece of control, and yet it's the part that is not in the public discussion. There should have been a huge outrage, because at the time when we were rejecting these patent applications saying, no, it's not an invention. In the US, an American farmer called Bauman had been buying seeds of soybean from an elevator and planting it. And his case went from the lower courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And I could not believe the decision of the Supreme Court, because he was saying, but I've just bought the seed from an elevator and planted it. I did not buy GMO seed from Monsanto. So how could I be infringing a patent issue? And the ruling in the Supreme Court, which someday should be challenged in some creative way, says a seed is a self-replicating machine invented by Monsanto. That's in the Supreme Court decision of Bauman versus Monsanto. Go and read it. The seed is a self-replicating machine. And I think that's really the issue of this ecological worldview of interconnectedness and the mechanical worldview of the plant is a machine and the fertilizer is fuel. Our bodies are machines and food is fuel. I go to schools very often to interact with young ones. And because our textbooks now are all just copied totally, I say, what's food? It's the fuel that runs the machine, that's our body. Little kids would say. Now, if it's just fuel, it doesn't matter, does it? If it's biofuel or biodiesel or diesel or gas, it doesn't matter. But because the body isn't a machine, it matters. What you're putting into it and how it was grown and where the seed began. The new work that's coming out, I mean, we always knew just by the fact that we save our ancient seeds. We don't call them heirloom in India because they're not, I mean, they are our normal seeds. That's what farmers have grown. We just call them native seeds or farmers' varieties. I also call them open pollinated and open source seed that can be shared and exchanged and multiplied freely. You have one seed, it can become 1,000. You have one seed for the millets, which are my favorite crops. The Green Revolution had made the millets backward grains, primitive grains. Our work is showing that we could grow 400 times more food. And the millets use 250 millimeters water, no water. They grow on the most rough territory and give you the delicious ragi and the delicious jangora. And, you know, when I started to save the seeds, and I encouraged farmers to save seeds, they'd grow the stuff. And the markets had been killed. So they'd say, but now you got to help us with the market. So I'd load the grain in my Jeep and take it to Delhi. And I'd call up friends. I said, come and take the organic millets. They'd come and say, but we don't know how to cook it. Next time I'd bring my farmers with me. You see, have a cooking class in our office. And then we realized, but in the city, they don't want that nice jangora ka khichdi, you know. So my colleague Maya started to do what she's done, new ways with old grains and ancient grains. And now we can do everything with ragi. I mean, we can make a dosa and we can make a pizza. And with jangora, we can make the most amazing rice. Why are the millets called millets? Any guess? Because one seed gives you 1,000,000 seeds. That's what's common in the family of millets. The tininess of the grain and the huge multiplicity. Now, can you imagine the abundance and generosity? So we do gardens with school children. And every garden is a sanctuary. So I remember going back to a school and I asked this little boy, so I said, well, what did you learn most? He said, Akka, you gave one tomato seed which I planted. And it gave us so many tomatoes. And we ate and we ate and we ate. And I saved a few for seed. And there's still hundreds of seed from that one seed. So much. We should never feel poor. The seed has the lessons of abundance. The seed has the lessons of generosity. Because if I've grown my rice and I share some of the rice seeds with you, I'm not poorer. Monsanto thinks it's poorer if someone shares or someone saves. And therefore, it's not just an ontological contest between creation and the destroyers. It is an ethical contest. Or will the greed of a poison cartel of 3 define what's the right thing to do for the planet, for our neighbors, for our children? We get a lot of old women coming to the Navdanya stores. and they will say, I come back for the dal because it's the first time since my childhood I can get that taste again. Now, taste is not an empty, subjective experience, contrary to Descartes, who thought there was secondary quality and primary qualities. The problem is the primary quality is just length and height and weight. Now, you can have rubbish of the same length and height and weight, or you can have more rubbish with more weight, which is the category called yield. And we've been made fools of in seed breeding by focusing on yield, which produces huge quantities of nutritionally empty toxic commodities. But our body is asking for something else. It's not asking for nutritional emptiness, it wants nutrition. So our work has shown that, for example, the native varieties of wheat that we have saved have 9% protein. And the Green Revolution varieties of Punjab have protein so low that they're getting rejected. 4% and less. Now, one of the big cases that I had to deal with was a case of Monsanto pirating ancient Indian wheats, which do not contribute to gluten allergy. I've given this phenomena the name biopiracy. I call it the second coming of Columbus. Columbus landed here and said, I've discovered America. Now it's ours, the Europeans said. The second coming of Columbus is Monsanto says, I've invented the seed. And very often, when they steal our knowledge, they've invented the knowledge. So the first case I had to deal with of biopiracy was the case of Neem. Now, the Neem campaign I had started in 1984, immediately after the Bhopal disaster. And the Bhopal disaster was because a pesticide plant had leaked. And I said, we don't need to kill people for pest control. And the campaign I started was no more Bhopal's plant a neem. 10 years later, I find the neem has been patented. And it took 11 years. I joined two other women, the head of the European Parliament, as well as the president of the IFOAM, which is the International Organic Movement. We joined hands and fought this case. I took 100,000 signatures of peasants and women and scientists from India to say this is a case of biopiracy. It was the first time such a case was brought to the European Patent Office. And it took us 11 years. But we defeated the WR race and the USDA of this biopiracy patent. And I remember this very clearly because it was 8th of March, which is Women's Day, and the hearing was held, and then the judges said, come back after lunch. Now, you don't know the level of Monsanto's influence, which is all over the place, and it could have been on that bench too. We come back after lunch, and the judges just smile and say, Happy Women's Day, you won. Because we were 3 women. We fought for 11 years with no money. Just love and friendship. Because every time we are made to feel poor for lack of money, we have to remember relationship, community, commons is the alternative. The stronger we are in our relationships, the more we can do together. We don't have to buy life. Life is not for sale. That was our slogan in Seattle when we stopped the World Trade Organization. And I remember walking down the street, and there was this young student carrying a book, my book Biopiracy, saying, I'm here because of this. I said, I'm here to stop it too. And we stopped the WTO in 1999 in Seattle. They were calling it the new constitution, that they would own all life on earth. And what does it take to not allow this ownership of life itself? The first is to be alert. I talked about the Neem patent. There was an attempt to patent the basmati. I'm from the Doon Valley, and the basmati from our valley is very famous. And a company called Rice Tech in Texas had patented it. The plant, the seed, the grain, the length of the height of the plant, the elongation quantity of the grain, and even the aroma, which is in the plant. And we did a campaign. I did the legal cases, but I also did a campaign. I went to Texas, and we did a campaign where it was not, the quick days. They did postcards, and the postcard said to USPTO, the US Patent and Trademark Office, said, if you do not strike this patent down, we will have to rename you the United States Piracy and Theft Office. And in the third case of our patent fight, it was Monsanto which patented an old Indian wheat variety because it does not contribute to gluten. Now, many people think wheat leads to gluten allergy. Wheat does not lead to gluten allergy. Industrial wheat breeding and industrial mechanical production and processing is what leads to gluten allergy for two reasons. First, with industrial breeding, you have uniformity. And the minute our gut faces the assault of a uniform molecule, it feels it is under attack. And it responds with allergies. Allergic reaction is a defense mechanism of our body against what it sees as an invasion. So the uniformity of breeding and the breeding to increase the elasticity for industrial processing has enhanced the expression of gluten. So it's not that there isn't gluten in the Indian wheats, but it's not expressed, it's silenced. So Monsanto found this out and took a patent. And this patent said the dough, all products, the seed, the grain, everything would be theirs. I trotted after the European Parliament again with a challenge. And it was heavy snow, stumping with my sari through the snow. And the head of the European Patent Office comes out of the office to greet me and said, "What a pleasure to see you again, Dr. Shiva." I said, "You should be thoroughly ashamed of yourself that we've had to return to fight a biopiracy case. Your office should not be granting biopiracy patents after the Neem case." This patent was struck down immediately. The other one took 11 years to fight. So the next time you want to deal with gluten allergies, you won't have to buy Monsanto's product. This wasn't a genetically modified wheat, just a stolen, pirated wheat. The new work on health is showing that all native varieties have much higher nutritional benefits, including huge phytochemicals. That's where the taste comes from. Because I've realized now that food is not stuff, food is not fuel. Food is communication. And good food is communicating well with our gut microbiome. And bad food is having a terribly nasty conversation. And all the diseases we are seeing are really a result of the fact that we forgot that food is living. Hippocrates had said, "Let food be thy medicine." In Ayurveda we say, "Annam sarva aushadhi." Good food is the cure for all diseases. And diseases from bad food can't be cured by anything.